All right, Isaiah 13. Isaiah describes the dreadful judgment of the wicked at the end of the age, including the final destruction of Babylon beyond what was partially fulfilled by the Persian conquest in 539 BC. Now, Isaiah in this chapter receives a multifaceted vision from the Lord, and the precise interpretations of each facet is really challenging for commentators and scholars to really adequately substantiate from this chapter alone. But there is clarity that can be brought into this chapter from later biblical prophets who elaborate on what Isaiah prophesies here. But if you're just going to interpret this exclusively from the chapter itself, you're kind of left with questions. And that's okay. I'm going to bring in a little bit of information to help us understand what's going on, but try not to jump to too many answers right away because we're going to get more answers as we go. So, all right. An oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah saw. On a bare hill, raise a signal. Cry aloud to them. Wave the hand for them to enter the gates of the nobles. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones. I've summoned the mighty men to execute my anger, my proudly exulting ones. At this point, Isaiah is referring to God summoning the nations. He's summoning somebody, obviously, but he's summoning the nations for a specific purpose. Now, that noble gates of verse 1 or verse 2, what's often translated as noble gates, scholars go back and forth about what does that mean. But a lot of translators will suggest that it's not just noble gates in the way that we would think of it as, present day Westerners or Americans, but they could be the gates where nobles would assemble for enlistment in battle. The gates of noble warriors. It would be kind of like the enlisting place for battle historically. I myself have commanded my consecrated ones. Now this army is consecrated not as holy and righteous and sanctified, but they're consecrated in the sense of for a purpose, for a distinct purpose in the mind of God that this army is going to accomplish. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's positive. In terms of just literally looking at the translation of that verse. And I've summoned my mighty men to execute my anger. These are instruments of God's judgment. My proudly exulting ones, again, is another one where this whole chapter, every commentator that I read, especially those who are really interested in the translating side, definitely admitted that there's difficulty in the specific translation, that there's difficulty with the certainty of what each of these is really meaning, or what the pictures that Isaiah is describing really translate exactly into. So the proudly exulting ones is contested. There's not a lot of certainty about exactly what this means, but it can be also translated depending on your translation. Some translations will say it's God's army. It is God's army, but it's an arrogant army. It's not just, they're not exalting God necessarily. It's uncertain exactly who they're exalting, but it could also mean that they are exalting themselves, that as God has summoned them for this purpose, that they are being built up in pride and arrogance in their perception of what that purpose is really going to be. So it doesn't necessarily mean they're the exalting of God. They're the exalting of themselves, a army of exceeding arrogance. I put that in the notes just as something to be mindful of as we look through some of these. So you have the sound of a tumult is on the mountains of a great multitude, the sound of an uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathering together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the nations for battle. And this has been said before in relation to the Lord summoning nations for battle that are not necessarily righteous nations or even for a righteous purpose, but they are instruments of judgment. In Isaiah chapter 5, in verse 25, I have this in the notes, and you can find it there. He will raise a signal for nations far away and whistle for them from the ends of the earth, and behold, quickly and speedily they come. And they are recipients of judgment. They're both the instruments of judgment and recipients of judgment in that case. In Micah chapter 4, which Micah prophesied parallel to Isaiah, they were contemporaries. Micah in chapter 4 starting in verse 11, says, "Now many nations are assembled against you, saying, 'Let her be defeated, and let our eyes gaze upon Zion.' But they do not know the thoughts of the Lord, and they do not understand his plan, that he has gathered them as sheaves to the threshing floor." Once again, they think they know what's going on, but they've got a purpose in their own hearts for why they're being summoned, but God has a purpose in his heart that is, of course, for the ultimate deliverance of his people. Verse 5, they come from a distant land, from the ends of the heavens. That's just understood to be figurative language, not necessarily like from heaven itself, but like from the edge of the horizon is sort of the language that Isaiah is using there. The Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. And again, what is the whole land? A lot of commentators suggest that he's talking about a massive kind of catastrophic destruction that is not just of one city, but it is of the earth. I mean, it is it's almost a regional in the sense of multinational. It would be an international conflict. And many commentators argue that whole land is the whole earth, that this is a global event that's taking place. And later biblical authors will suggest that would be the correct interpretation. If you're taking it just from this chapter, though, it's not quite totally sure. But a lot of commentators argue, no, whole land can mean the whole earth, and that would be appropriate. And later biblical authors affirm that in a pretty strong way, which we're going to look at in later chapters and later weeks. Then, Isaiah describes the dread of God's judgment afflicting. He uses descriptions of dread that are applied to different people at different times in the unfolding of God's redemptive plan. For example, in Micah chapter 4, Micah describes Israel's dread of the Antichrist forces during the final tribulation. But another example, in Psalm 48, verse 6, that psalmist uses the same language to describe the Antichrist forces' dread of the Messiah at his arrival. It's very similar language. And so which one is Isaiah referring to here in chapter 13? Again, if you're looking at it just from this chapter, you're not entirely certain. But this is where I might give you a couple of hints, because Isaiah does not explicitly say which period he's referring to or which people are being filled with dread. But it's likely best to read this section maybe as elements of both periods. But like I said, later chapters give us more insight, and maybe I'll pull some of that in as we read this here. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near, as destruction from the Almighty will come. Therefore, all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. Now understand, Micah 4 is describing Israel's dread, and it's saying, "Writhe and groan, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in labor." And then you have Psalm 48 saying, "For behold, all the kings assemble. They came together, and trembling took hold of them there. Anguish as a woman in labor." I mean, it's kind of been both ways. Therefore, all hands will be feeble, and every human heart will melt. They will be dismayed. Pangs of agony will seize them. They will be in anguish like a woman in labor. They will look aghast at one another. Their faces will be aflame. Wow, that's terrifying language. "Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy sinners from it." So at this point, we get maybe a little bit more of a glimpse. It looks like the Lord is raising up a judgment army that is not specifically just a judgment against Israel, but this is a judgment that is transcendent of God's discipline of Israel, but there's wrath involved in what's happening here that extends beyond Israel, but even into Gentile nations that are being afflicted by what's happening. So their feeble knees, they'll be dismayed, pangs will seize them, they look aghast, and this is more than just God's discipline of Israel, but there are Gentile nations that are experiencing the dread of this because God is using this as an instrument not just of discipline, but of wrath. And there's both elements. There's discipline of the righteous during the rebellion and tribulation, and there is wrath against those who oppose God's covenant during that same period. So that's why it matters kind of who the subject is that we're looking at. And I do think in chapter 13, there is an army that is executing God's wrath that is actually affecting and afflicting the planet. Like I said, when we look back here at verse 5, the whole land. All right. Who is that? Well, if we were going to guess based on what we've studied so far, Isaiah chapter 10 probably gives us the best indicator that it is the Lord raising up the Antichrist. That it is the Antichrist who is acting destructively the Lord is using the Antichrist's ambition and his arrogance to inflict judgment on the nations, not just Israel, but actually on the nations. And we'll get more into affirming that in later chapters. But up to this point, Isaiah 10 and Isaiah 13 probably are reflecting each other back and forth here. Because again, in Isaiah 10, Isaiah substantiates that the Lord is using the Antichrist as an instrument. And here it is again, an instrument, an army is being used as an instrument of God's wrath against sinners on the earth. Could it be the Lord? Isaiah is describing the Antichrist and his aggression during the tribulation, afflicting the nations of the earth. It seems highly likely. Could this be one of the seals of the book of Revelation? Likely, but we haven't gotten to that yet. So that's why I'm trying not to pull too much into this, but you start to kind of get it when you're looking at it in the whole context of the redemptive plan and the chapters that we've studied so far. Oh my word, where were we? Oh yeah, right here. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel wrath, fierce anger, to make the land a desolation and to destroy sinners from it. For the land, or for the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give off their light. The sun will be dark at its rising and the moon will not shed its light. Now there's cosmic signs happening. And interestingly, remember, there was a solar eclipse that occurred a little bit before the time of Isaiah. I think it's more closer to the time of Amos. But this would be something that Isaiah's audience would have in their living memory. And for where Israel was on the planet, probably would have been a partial solar eclipse at the time. But we looked at that in a previous week, I think when we were looking at Amos, because Amos talks about these cosmic signs very similarly, and he describes what could be essentially a solar eclipse. And there is a documented solar eclipse in Amos's day. This could be that. But this is also more than that, because we know that there are cosmic signs associated with the end of the age as well. So we don't have to limit it just to Isaiah's day. I will punish the world for its evil. Now, again, if we're looking at the context of the ultimate fulfillment, well, then absolutely, yeah, there are cosmic signs that chapter 10 would be applicable to. So here we go, verse 11. I will punish the world for its evil. It's not just Israel for Israel's rebellion. It's the world for its evil. It's a bigger scope what God's doing here. And I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant. Again, it's the day of the Lord is the day against pride. It's the day where all of the lofty pride and overconfidence of humanity will be brought low, and only the Lord and his chosen Messiah will be exalted in that day. This is what we looked at in previous weeks. And I will put an end to the pomp of the arrogant and lay low the pompous pride of the ruthless. I will make people more rarer than fine gold. Okay, now what are we looking at here? I will make people more rare than fine gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. It really, commentators don't have a really good way to explain that away, other than there's a catastrophic event related to the tribulation that results in population collapse. And who is it a population collapse of? Well, the scope we're looking at here is removing sinners from the planet. To make the land a desolation and destroy sinners from it. The whole land, I will punish the world for its evil. So something massive is in view here. Really, Isaiah 13 comes really close to mirroring what John the Apostle sees in the book of Revelation related to the bowl judgments, like the final judgments. It really sounds like if you were to go read John's description in Revelation of the bowl judgments, that there would be parallels here. I will make people rarer than fine gold, and mankind rarer than the gold of Ophir. Then I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place. There's massive earthquakes. Now, interestingly, what is this about the earth being, shaken out of its place? What is that supposed to mean? Well, let's go back to Japan in 2011. A 9.0 magnitude earthquake struck off the coast of Japan, and it's documented by scientists that that earthquake was so strong that it shifted the Earth's axis by 16 centimeters, enough to shorten the length of an Earth day by 1.8 microseconds. Now, 1.8 microseconds is not that long, but that was, that earthquake shook the Earth and adjusted its place a little bit. And so there are earthquakes of that magnitude at the end of the age. You can see where that language is coming from. Now, I have the documentation from NASA about that 2011 earthquake in the notes. So that's footnoted there. You can see that. I will make the heavens tremble. The earth will be shaken out of its place. The wrath of the Lord of hosts, the day of his fierce anger. Now, this is very much the cup of God's wrath. We talked about the cup of God's blessing and the cup of God's wrath described in his covenants, especially in the earlier weeks of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But there is like a full expression of God's wrath on the earth in these verses, which again really parallels well how John describes the bowl judgments in the book of Revelation. And like a hunted gazelle, like sheep without, well, at this point, I can actually get into a couple of verses that YouTube won't like because they're quite dreadful descriptions of people fleeing and being captured and being run through and slain. And there's a pretty specific context for what's happening in verses 14 through 16 that I want to come back to because they're easier to explain with the help of later prophets. Because if you look at this, it's dreadful. But if you're able to look at it in the context of the Lord is raising up the Antichrist as an instrument of wrath against sinners, then verses 14 to 16 might make a little bit sense. Because this is not the Messianic army of Israel. This is not Jesus. This is something being committed by some really wicked people as an instrument of God's wrath on the earth. Were that to be the Antichrist armies, then I think this would make a little bit more sense. That's a little bit of conjecture to say that at this point just with Isaiah 13, but later weeks, that'll become a little bit more clear. And so that, though, is going to be my hint to you to suggest what that means. All right, verses 17 and on, we're going to come to the end of 13 here pretty quickly. Let me make sure I'm catching up on my notes. Oh, sure. Behold, I'm stirring up the Medes. So verses 17 and 18 really are about historically what's going to become the defeat of Babylon at the hands of the Persians. And so what Isaiah is talking about here is more related to what Daniel sees in the empire succession, where it goes from Assyria to Babylon to Persia, again to Greece and Rome. So that's what he's seeing, that these are real historical in terms of, these are probably fulfilled historically in verses 17 and 18, but there's more than that. He says that yes, Babylon's going to be destroyed historically, but it's a reflection of something final that's in God's heart of his grand redemptive plan. Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the splendor and pomp of the Chaldeans will be like Sodom and Gomorrah when God overthrew them. There's a massive defeat of the fall of Babylon. It does have historical fulfillment in an interim way in 539. Yeah, I've got it in the notes, 539 BC. But more than that, there's a destruction at the end of the age that happens at the hand of the Antichrist, which we're going to get to look at, that Isaiah's looking at here in chapter 13. So it will never again be inhabited or lived in for all generations. Now, one of the reasons why we know Isaiah 13 is not only historically fulfilled is because there is a representation of ancient Babylon today. There's a modern day Babylon. There are modern day settlers, inhabitants of Babylon today. And so for Isaiah to be prophesying that it will never be inhabited or lived in for all generations, well, it is today. So this can't have been fulfilled in that day because we have inhabitants in what is historic Babylon today. How would that work? So we are looking at both a prophesied destruction that was interim fulfilled in history with the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire, but you have a final fulfillment at the end of the age. And that is what is being looked at here. It will never again be inhabited or lived in for all generations. No Arab will pitch his tent there. And again, thousands of Arabs pitch their tent quote unquote, in Babylon today. And there's lots of archaeological stuff going on there. I mean, it's a historic site in Iraq, to be sure. No Arab will pitch his tent there. No shepherds will make their flocks lie down there, but wild animals will lie down there. Their houses will be full of howling creatures, and ostriches will dwell there, and wild goats, all of that. It's kind of like the scavengers of the earth, the wild beasts, that kind of thing. Hyenas will cry in its towers, and jackals in the pleasant places. And its time is close at hand, and its days will not be prolonged. Now, I do think that it matters. Later prophets are going to really make certain that we know that it matters. That Isaiah in chapter 13 has described the same thing he's talking about in chapter 10. The Lord uses the wrath and ambition and pride of the Antichrist as an instrument of his wrath on the earth. And part of that is the way that the Lord uses the Antichrist against the final representation of Babylon. We're going to get into, there's a lot more detail about what that means in Jeremiah and in the New Testament and chapters that we're going to get to. But it's already here. We're seeing the foundation of this teaching in Isaiah 10 and Isaiah 13, and what we're going to look at in the next week with later chapters in Isaiah. Isaiah himself goes on to elaborate about this. The Lord uses the Antichrist and his arrogance and pride and bloodlust, his ambition for conquest to destroy the pride of humanity that is embodied in Babylon, the end time Babylon. And there you go, Babylon, the glory of kingdoms. So we'll get on to, what all that's really going to look like in more chapters. But here it is. I mean, really being outlined for us in sort of an introductory way here in Isaiah 13. It's interesting, though, to think that it's a lot more obvious in the book of Revelation how the Lord uses the Antichrist and his loyalists to betray and destroy the end-time representation of Babylon. But it's interesting to see it so early on in history here that Isaiah is depicting this. And it does leave us with a little bit of mystery at this point in our study and exactly what all that looks like, but it's exciting for us to be able to get into. But one of the things that stands out about this is that there's wicked leaders attacking wicked leaders within the wicked leadership that is of the earth, which we're going to get into this in a later chapter. I'm trying not to jump too far ahead because there's more about this actually next week in chapters 23 through 29 or however far we get next week. But just the infighting, the lack of, the disloyalty within the ranks of the wicked leadership of the earth at the end of the age is a huge deal. So we see that represented here in a small way, kind of in an introductory glance. But man, Isaiah is really going to double down on this in later chapters, that wicked leaders will betray each other. And the chief of that betrayal is the Antichrist betrayal of the end time Babylon. So I know that's a lot to say just for chapter 13, but that's what we're getting into. And I'm so excited to get into those later chapters. All right, we're going to move on.